167 days in space, over 38 hours performing spacewalks, traveling more than 6 million miles, making hundreds of orbits about the Earth. But how did I get there? This is the making of an ordinary spaceman. I'm Clayton C. Anderson, and these are my stories.
Well, hey everybody out there listening to the latest episode of our podcast, The Making of an Ordinary Spaceman. Today we have a very special guest, a special guest for me, in that we have talked many times about how this podcast seeks to bring to the forefront the idea that I became a successful astronaut, or I became the ordinary spaceman, not because of things that I did exactly, but because of the people who made me the person that I am today. And as part of that story, as part of that buildup to the making of an ordinary spaceman, we want to dial back in time a little bit to when I became a baby engineer at Johnson Space Center with the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And at that time, walking into the hallowed halls of Building 30 at the Mission Control Area of NASA at JSC, I had some colleagues, some office mates, some people that were my age. We entered into this adventure at approximately the same time, and we spent a lot of quality time together, and we learned a lot together. So today, I'd like to welcome in my latest podcast guest, Mr. Blair Nader, a NASA engineer who has been working there for, I guess, Blair, what, 30 plus years now?
Just past 39 last week.
39 years. Did you ever think you would work for 39 years at the Johnson Space Center?
No, I didn't. No, I didn't. And I made some financial decisions based on not being here.
Well, Blair and I began, I want to say, Blair, we both started about 1983. Is that right?
Didn't you come down summer of 1982 for your first internship?
Yeah, my first internship was actually in 81 when I worked in the data systems and analysis division. And I would come back a year later to work with the folks we worked with in mission planning and analysis division. And I think you were probably a full-timer in 82, right?
I was a full-timer in 82. Yeah, so I was there full-time. Eric was there full-time. And I think we were the first two, and then you were the intern. Yeah.
I was the intern. Hey, you got to be careful how you say intern these days, right? It gets a lot of people in a lot of trouble.
You're going to get me in trouble.
No, I'm not. So, Blair, as we start out today, why don't you tell us a little bit about you, where you're from, how you got to be at NASA, and a little bit about what you're doing today.
I grew up in Louisville, Ohio. That's a suburb of Canton, Ohio. You might recognize that from Football Hall of Fame, among other things. In a big ethnic family. My family, from early on, it was made clear I was going to go to college. That was expected. And my family, especially my mom, were big supporters of the space program. They were just very enthusiastic. My mother's still nuts about the program. She called me last week about a launch that I didn't know what she was talking about. I'd been working all week and didn't pick up some. She still follows it avidly. I studied physics at Kent State. Spring break my senior year, through a friend of a friend, I made a contact out here, and I drove down here to talk to them.
In your gold Camaro?
No, we brought a buddy of mine's Cutlass, but the Camaro was there. It just didn't come to Houston yet.
Okay.
I came down, and this person that I met with was Dave O'Brien. He ended up safety. He's retired now. Dave spent 3 hours with me. And I thanked him, and I ended up going back home to Ohio. And he sent me an application and talked to people. And, hey, you ought to look at this guy. I've talked to him. And the ball got rolling. And at that time, 82 was at the It was on the front end of the collapse in the Rust Belt. And I was one of only a handful of people in my graduating class in physics that had a job right out of school. I came down here, and it's been a heck of a good time ever since.
Yeah, you never left.
No, I never left. You know, there are bad days like any other job, but man, this has been a great place to work.
Well, excellent. So tell us about what you did as a baby engineer at MPAD, and then jump forward and tell them what you do now.
Well, like Clay, I started out working trajectory, figuring out how to get a spacecraft from one point in space to the other. And there's what I'll call close-in work, proximity operations, and then there's longer, miles and miles and miles away work, and that's called rendezvous. I was lucky. I had a taste of both. I think if I remember right, Clay, you really specialized in the prox ops part of that. I got to do a little of both. And I did that for a number of years, and I started to do a lot of what I'll call integration, making the pieces fit together. If everybody is working in silos, hey, my job is propulsion, and hey, my job is computers, and hey, my job is life support, somebody better be looking over the whole thing to go, did you know that he wasn't planning to provide power to your device? Somebody's got to do that. Today they use this, I'm not doing it justice when I say this. Today they use a buzzword, system engineering and integration. And there's a great deal of education that goes into that. Well, I kind of learned it as I went. And that expanded. And I did some project management work. And then I had the opportunity to come over to the flight operations directorate. It was the mission operations directorate then. And I spent years trying to figure out how are we going to assemble and activate the International Space Station that Clay flew on. And then I was lucky enough that I started to move up the ranks a little bit. And I'm now a second line manager. They call that a branch chief. And my people do a lot of technical integration. I have a team that works on the space station. I have a team that works on the commercial crew rockets, both the Boeing and the SpaceX guys. I have a team that works on the upcoming lunar and Mars stuff. Man, they're working hard. And I have a team that works on our Orion and Space Launch System functions. And they're each led by a really good first line supervisor. So that's what I do now.
Let me clarify for the listeners that when Blair talks about operations directorate, which we called when we were there together mission operations, now it's flight operations, versus what Blair and I grew up with, which is more of the data development, looking into the insides of everything, right? And creating and running simulations and trying to figure out if it's going to be successful on paper. And then when we prove that it's going to be okay, we kind of hand that over to the guys where Blair went in operations, and they're the ones that execute it. They're the people you see on TV all the time that sit in the control center, that talk to the crew, that talk to the leader of the team, the flight director, to make sure everything happens right. So Blair, go back now to when we were youngsters in mission planning analysis. And what I want people to hear on the podcast is I want to get your thoughts on the people that we worked with, because we were in the midst of brilliance. And I don't know that I certainly didn't recognize that, right? It took me a while to understand that you and I and Eric Von Mitchell and Rick Deppish and Kevin Lewis and the people we grew up with at the Johnson Space Center, we were in the presence of greatness, and maybe we didn't realize that.
Yeah, that's true. My earliest memories are just being in awe. I mean, I showed up and my immediate boss, our immediate boss, Bob Becker, Bob was on leave, so his boss, Ken Young, the branch chief, a guy that he'd be my today, Ken came down, and Ken's this 6'4", lanky, stereotypical Texan. And he's just laid back, kind of talks a little bit slow. And the guy guy is scary, brilliant. He is.
He's just plain scary too.
I think Ken was just admitted into a Hall of Fame kind of thing with the UT engineering department. Ken was a very heavy hitter.
Yeah.
But then a week later, I get to meet my boss, my first line supervisor, and he walks in. He's got these cowboy boots on and this big old beard. And God rest him, the guy looked like the Bud Man. And if you go Google that, he looked just like the Bud Man. Go Google that. That's what Bob
was his nickname.
And he had this I don't give a care attitude. And then you watched him and you realized he was another brilliant guy. The story's going about Bob for hours. But then there were guys that were not in the management chain that as you got to know them, you realized, oh man. And early on, Mickey Donahue, which was an old mentor of Clay's, you may meet him someday. Mickey told me early on, just when you get to thinking you know something, you'll find out there's a whole bunch more you don't know. And he was, to this day, almost 40 years later, he was right. I'm always peeling the onion because there's always somebody smarter than me, which may not be surprising to you, Clay, but, I mean, there's always somebody smarter. And you gotta be humble enough to just realize that.
Right.
And you got to be smart enough to learn what you can. And then you got to be assertive enough to say, wait a minute, what about this? Even with the brilliant ones. And that's one of the things I like the most about this place is that collegial atmosphere. But back then we were young. We it took us a while to snap to the fact that Gus Babb knew a heck of a lot of stuff. Or how much Jerry Kahanik and some of those other guys knew, Rocky Duncan. I mean, they seemed laid back and easy going, but they had flown Apollo and then they had done the planning for Space Shuttle's first missions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's amazing to me. You mentioned some names that I hadn't thought about, Gus Babb and Kahanik, in a long time. But the names Lineberry and Claude Graves and Ken Young and Becker and Richard Kincaid. There were
Dick,
Sam Mayfield. There were geniuses everywhere, and these guys, they were kind of like a group of misfits, right? They partied hard. They worked really hard, but they sometimes partied even harder. Our boss was Bob Becker for a long time. Just an amazing man and a unique individual. There were stories that abounded about him. He was in a bar one time, I guess, and just enjoying himself. And some dude came in with a hammer and was going to assault somebody else. And when this dude reached back with the hammer, he whacked our boss on the back of the head and knocked him cold. I mean, he drove a Jeep through a plate glass window one time. It just crazy stuff. And Blair and I would sit there and we'd listen to this stuff and we'd think, are you kidding? Really? It was just
they did this crap.
Unique. Mm-hmm. I remember Mickey Donahue telling me stories when he was what do they call it? A guy that collected delinquent loans back in the day when he worked for his dad.
Yeah.
And somebody owed him money on a car, so they went to repossess the car. And the way the story goes is the guy was fighting him for it, right? So Mickey ended up tying something to the radiator and said he was repossessing the radiator, but the car just happened to come along with it when he pulled. And
all these guys had their stories.
Well, and what I remember about Blair was when I came in as a summer intern in 1982, Blair was a full-timer. So Blair had gone through all the, human resource stuff. He'd signed up for his health insurance and his life insurance, and he knew what his badge was and where he was going to, all that sort of thing. And Blair at his desk, when I walked by, had a stack of white, what NASA calls internal notes. And Blair had a yellow highlighter, and Blair was just always diligently for the first, month I was there, he was always reading and highlighting and reading and highlighting. So talk a little bit about how they trained back then, how we learned.
I don't think, in hindsight, I don't think they had thought through how they wanted to train us. And I don't mean that in a critical fashion. These guys came off of Apollo, and then after Apollo, there was a big dearth on hiring. I mean, the agency's budget went way down. And to my knowledge, other than like occasional co-ops, people like Dallas Ives that they picked up,
in Iowa State.
I don't. Yeah, and I don't think they had hired a full timer in years.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't, in the mission ops part of things, the guys who worked in mission control, they had detailed training manuals and all those internal notes and whatnot that showed you here's how stuff works, because those guys had to go certify and work in mission control, which I eventually did, but that was years later. In MPAD, they really hadn't thought that through. So they said, okay, you guys talk to Mickey Donahue, you talk to Al DuPont, you talk to Jim Kirkpatrick, and you guys just figure it out. Let us know if you need help, kind of a thing. And okay, thank God I was young. We were young enough that we were aggressive and we wanted to learn, and we badgered the stink out of them until some of the elders taught us. And some elders were more willing than others. My perception to this day is that early in shuttle, there were still some people protecting their turf. Hey, man, I've got this. I don't want to teach you how to do it. So, okay, well, that's fine. That's how I got into International Space Station. Early on, my very first day at work, I started working on the space station. It was pre-phase A, me and Jerry Bell. And the more the guys, I tried to learn what the guys had to teach me, but I got more and more and more into space station to cut my own niche. And, it's almost 40 years later, I still work on space station. But then we had some really good fortune too, because if you remember, Clay, when we were young, we still had the Blue Suiter unit.
Mm-hmm.
At one time, the United States Air Force was going to fly shuttles occasionally and fly them themselves. They were going to fly them out of Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. Right. So they sent a unit of really smart people who had been educated on aerospace, and they said, go learn how NASA does its job. And I had the great privilege to work with those people, because some of them, especially by the time they got to be captains or majors, they understood that their job was to bring up younger officers. But some of them also took us under their wing. I mean, Rocky Avento, what a character. This guy from New York City. He was loud and fun, and he was a great guy, but he would always pull me aside and guide me.
Uh-huh.
We had another Air Force officer. He was a detailee. He wasn't part of the unit. He was in plain clothes. John Wheeler. John ended up a retired colonel from the Air Force. John spent a great deal of time teaching Eric and I think you too, Clay. I had no aerospace background. I was a physics major. I knew a heck of a lot about physics, but now you got to apply that. People like Clay, who came out of school, had aerospace degrees. So they knew what orbital mechanics and things like that were. I went, the heck is that? And I went and tried to understand it. Well, thank God for John. John taught me a great deal. Last time I saw John face to face was at your launch, Clay. And we got through it. Nobody abused us. Dear God, they were all busy as heck. They saw we were learning. They saw we were, and they may have been, honestly, I think Bob Becker in particular was testing us. Okay, you guys are going to sink or swim. Let's see. Go figure it out.
Yeah, I can only imagine it. That's how they learned, right? If you think back to the whole situation of space for the United States, it was new. And everybody that came here from the NACA back in those days in Virginia, that then came to Houston, they were all learning on the fly. They were making this stuff up. And I think those guys that we worked with all were part of that, and they expected kind of the same thing from us.
I didn't feel abused. I felt privileged as I could possibly be. Look where I'm working, Ma! You know, how lucky can I get? It doesn't get better than this. Until I moved over to work in mission control. That was even cooler.
Yeah, I think that as a young engineer myself, I was under the tutelage of a man named Mickey Donahue, he and I became great friends, and I spent a lot of time with his family as a young person, and he was brilliant in an Alabama sort of way, right? The guy came from South Alabama and was just an amazing person with an amazing heart. But there was competition back then. There was competition between the folks that Blair and I worked with, who developed the behind the scenes information that those guys in operations were going to eventually learn. And speak to us a little bit, Blair, about that competition between, not just between operations and analysis, the MPATers and the MODers, right? Talk about the competition between us, you, me, Eric, right? Because we were young, we were trying to move up that
we all thought we were going to be center director. I mean, we did. We were, right out of school. If I work my tail off, I'll get a promotion faster than you. Every single one of us was that way, except Rick, who was so laid back, God bless him.
Rick Deppish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nothing fazed Rick. He was brilliant too. There was competition, but there's competition I think there's competition in any job where you have young people who busted their hump to get through college, and now they're going to go out here and they're going to learn. And there was always you and me and Eric. And I remember, tell me what you remember. Al DuPont ended up our boss. Bob went on to another job. Al's another good friend of Clay's and I. Al was very perceptive. I remember Al had three young stallions in his stable, me, Clay, and Eric Mitchell. And if Al had a job that required finesse, and where it was absolutely not okay to rub somebody wrong, he would throw that job to Clay. Because Clay had, from the beginning, people skills that Eric and I never did master. But if he had a job that required great precision, no, you have to have this answer to 6 decimal places, he would hand that to Eric Mitchell. If he had a job that they were stonewalling or he just, I don't know how we're going to get through this, but it's got to get done. A lot of times he'd throw that to me because I was too dumb to know that you can't just run people over in that first. Put the arm out and go. And it took me a number of years to figure out that was a bad policy. But Al was very adept at using his people for what they were strong at.
Yeah, and just know that Blair's nickname kind of was the Bulldog, right? Because Al could sick him on anybody. And Eric Von Mitchell, bless his soul, he's not with us anymore, but he was so proud. Eric was the first in his family to gain a college degree. He came to our organization and had more vim and vigor than most, and he was hugely excited to come to work every day. I think that between the three of us, I was never quite sure how much that I was contributing at the time, right? Because you never really know. But I remember a quick story when Blair's stack of internal notes, right? One of the things that I would be tasked to do later was I wrote an external note as Blair did. Blair wrote one on a subject we call the operational control zones for the International Space Station, envisioning that we'd have all these vehicles up there and satellites and servicing platforms and all these things that needed to be kept in an airport-like environment with class A, B, C, and D airspace, right? So we had that same concept for the station, which Blair wrote about. And I had another document about how we were going to get shuttles and these vehicles in and out from the space station. And I remember
without blowing the arrays off, yeah.
Without blowing anything up, right? And Eric's big part of that was to work on some of the data. I was working on the systems integration like Blair was talking about, and Blair was working on his control zones. And I remember I got to the point where I talked to a headhunter, and I went to Colorado because several of our colleagues were getting disingenuous with NASA, and they weren't happy with where they were going or whatever the reason, but they were talking to headhunters. And I ended up in Martin Marietta, Colorado for a job interview. And I remember the guy that was going to interview me was busy, and he sent me to be with one of his young engineers. And that young engineer was talking to me and telling me about all the specific NASA support that we are working on here at Martin Marietta. And he said, and this is the document that we follow precisely with NASA specifications. And I remember he sets this document down. I look at it, and I'm thinking inside, this is going to be good. And I turn the page, the cover page open, and NASA typically has the cover page, and then they have the signature page of the people that did the document. And I turned to the signature page, and I pointed to my name and my signature on the document that he was touting. And boy, he got really quiet really fast.
Funny how that worked.
So Blair,
yeah.
I want to talk about a little bit of our outside of work stuff. Talk to the podcast people about what we call Nerd Day.
I wish I could erase that from your memory. You know, just about a month ago, I get an email from the head of the Canadian Space Agency liaison office, who used to be a mere mortal like you and I, and is now a big dog. And he's got that picture attached. Hey, was this you?
The one by the rockets or the one by the Corvettes?
The one by the rockets. The one you have that you constantly post.
Yeah.
So Nerd Day was fun. It really was fun. Somewhere along the line, one of the older secretaries, because we still had government civil service secretaries. Today they contract.
Faye Conway was her name.
It may have been Faye. And some of the in a desk somewhere, she found this folder full of old badge pictures. The pictures that well, it's
you got to flip it around there. There you go.
The badges that you used to get on site, and they were all black and white photos. Well, it's all these guys that we now work with, the guys we were talking about that were the kickers and the guy from South Alabama, and and they're all in white shirts and these skinny black ties, which were that was dress in the 1960s. And at that time, NASA had kind of an unofficial, you're supposed to wear a shirt and tie, and there's lots of stories about that gag. And we're looking at these and we're going, look, that's Hal Beck. Look, that's so-and-so. Look, that's so-and-so. There's Jerry Bell.
Yeah.
And so we put our heads together, and I don't know whose brilliant idea it was. There were about 6 of us young guys. Mm-hmm. And we said, okay, Friday, we're going to be Nerd Day. Everybody dress up like that. And we'll come in. And the oldsters freaked. What the devil? And then Clay walks in, and then Eric walks in, and then Jerry walks in, and then there's about 10 of us, and then somehow guys in other directorates hear about this, and they I don't know how the heck they hear about it, but anyway, we're all sitting there, little skinny black ties and white shirts, and we got tape on our glasses and pockets full of pens, and we are just having a ball working that day.
Point out to everybody that back in those days, that's when the nerd movie, Revenge of the Nerds and Revenge of the Nerds.
That's true, Clay, yeah.
And all those movies had just come out, right, with Skolnick. And so all of us dressed up like this for work, thinking that it would be fun, and it was hilarious.
It was well received.
Oh, the older guys loved it. And then we all decided we were going to go have lunch across the street it's a Fuddruckers, and most people are familiar with the Fuddruckers restaurant chain, but we all went over there. We had a table booked out, and we went, and at Fuddruckers, you order your meal and you give them a name, right? And they're going to call the name over the microphone. So all of us decided that we were going to use names of early astronauts, So all of a sudden, we're sitting at our table in our skinny black ties, white shirts, pocket protectors, crazy slacks, high water pants, and they're yelling out names like Neil Armstrong, your order's ready. Gus Grissom, your order's ready. And the people in the restaurant are looking around. Of course, they know where it's coming from because there are a bunch of grown-ups acting like children in nerd costumes. So, but then I want you to tell them about Jay Larkins a little bit later, though, Blair. Can you tell them about that?
I'm trying to remember. You might have to jog my memory, buddy.
When we all went over after work for a little happy hour activity, and we carried our textbooks and our calculators and our slide rules, we were all dressed up as nerds.
Yeah.
Big table such that we could see the door, and anytime a pretty young lady walked in, all the nerds, just like in the movie, hi girls.
Yeah, we did that.
We scared.
It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun, except for the pictures that I wish hadn't been taken so that Clay could stop showing them to everybody. People
are getting a kick out of the fact that we were normal. And so now let's tie some of this together, right? We've talked about our history as young engineers. We've talked about a little bit about our relationships with some of these guys. So now, if we fast forward a little bit, you have a colleague that you used to work with who's been selected as a United States astronaut. So talk to the listeners about that, and then about my first launch and my second launch, and what you, Blair Nader, a colleague of mine, a friend of mine from years past, are now thinking about as you see all this transpiring.
Clay, I can't remember, but it seems like you applied multiple times.
15.
You worked really hard to get their attention, and we all watched. And of course, you moved over to the flight ops side, we would watch, and Clay would apply, and we'd all go, come on, go.
And then
hey man, somebody's got to win. It may as well be you. If you don't play, you can't win.
Exactly.
And you're not the only one who applied a number of times. You may hold the record, but I found out that one of the most brilliant astronauts I've ever met applied 4 times. I'm not going to name names, but I went, you? Yeah, I mean it happens. And I don't know the magic of how that gets decided. It's none of my business as a mere mortal. But I remember we'd watch, and then Clay would make the right moves. Okay, I continue to do sports refereeing. That's an unusual extracurricular activity. And at that time, it seemed like such things were useful when you applied. Plus, Clay just plain loved sports. The guy's a sports fanatic. So being out there being a referee was just more of the same.
Right.
And then I remember right along the way, you got a pilot's license. And along the way, he said, okay, I'm going to do something unusual to show them I can do something unusual. And if I remember right, weren't you one of the very early emergency ops center managers?
Yeah, I was actually kind of the first, I think.
Okay, I was trying to remember. JSC reorganized how it would respond to emergency things that happened on site, and they formed up something called an emergency ops center. And for whatever reason, they put that under the purview of operations. And Clay stepped into that, said, yeah, I can do that. And he organized it and got it up and running and worked with the other directorates to make it successful. Again, demonstrating I can do unusual things. I can make stuff happen. And none of those struck you as important at the time, but when you look back on them, you go, okay, those were all slowly but surely, not just keeping him interested, engaged, but also building his resume, building his skill base, demonstrating what he can do.
Yeah, I didn't want to, believe it or not. When the emergency operations job came up, I was in operations, and I said, I'm interested. The email came from the boss.
Yeah.
Are you anybody interested in this? And I said, yeah, I'm interested. And the next thing I knew, I was in a high-level meeting of another subject, and they said, hey, the center director, George Abbey, wants to talk to you because he wants you to be the new emergency operations center director. I thought, what? And I didn't
in those days, are you interested was equivalent to you're about to be drafted. I can name 3 or 4 other times that happened to people.
But it turned out to be one of the best jobs I ever had. So
I always thought it looked like a good job.
Yeah.
Creating something from scratch is good work.
Yes.
Look, and get out of my way. Let me solve this hard problem. I'm an engineer.
Well,
and you did that.
Operations was perfect for that, right?
Uh-huh.
To plan, train, and we say plan, train, fly, but to plan, train, and execute is the perfect mantra for an emergency operations center. And when I got over there, I would learn that they didn't know any of that stuff. And whereas a flight controller has what we call a bold-faced procedure, right? If A happens, you do this, then you do this, then you do this, and then you worry about the details. These guys were reading through phone books of information, trying to give they were 911 call recipients, basically, and they were trying to give advice without having the information. And it also turned out that they had never simulated an emergency ever at the Johnson Space Center, and that's what Mission Ops did. So we began to simulate emergencies. So great job. Sorry, keep going, buddy.
No, it was, and then one day the announcement comes out, and we look at that list, and Clay's on there, and everybody goes, yeah. And I'm sure you got flooded with phone calls. I know I was at least a couple of those. And then I'll always remember this really great party. I think it was at your house. Your wife got everybody together who knew you, and we had a going away party because he was leaving the mortal plane and moving up to the 6th floor astronaut office. Astronauts are like superheroes. I mean, you never want to read an astronaut resume. You'll feel like the dumbest human being on earth because they're all supermen and superwomen. Some of these people have multiple PhDs, and like, really? And Clay was an astronaut, but he was moving up to the up. It was like in the right stuff, moving to the top of the ziggurat. The rest of us were there supporting. And there was this great party his wife had at their house, and I bet there were 150 people in that house, in the garage, in the backyard. And these were all people who were there because they loved Clay, and they were all really happy for him. And it wasn't just engineers. I mean, it was everybody who knew Dave. Your buddy Dave, who I can't remember his last name, from basketball.
David Ward. Yep.
That's it.
David Ward.
And
another podcast guest.
Okay. Yeah, that's appropriate. But it was so cool. And Clay's proudly showing off, kind of shyly. He holds up his jumpsuit. It didn't have all the groovy patches because he was a baby duck fan. And everybody's like, ooh, because this is really cool. I mean, here's a regular guy we knew, guy we sat with, guy we drank with, and he has just ascended to the top of the mountain. And then he got to fly.
Yeah.
I remember you were going, was it 15? Expedition 15?
Yeah. Yeah.
I was running a training facility, and Clay came down out of one of the mock-ups after a class, and he saw me and he yelled at me, "Nader, get your butt over here." And I come over, and he comes down these steps, and he puts this Expedition 15 lanyard around my neck. That's lanyard holds your badge, right?
Yes, sir.
And that may not have
red.
seemed like a big deal to anybody else, but I knew this dude. And he had taken a minute to give me one of these very limited edition special small gifts. And I still got it in the desk here somewhere. I wore it for years. And then it was time to fly. And I don't run around with astronauts. This letter shows up at the house. You're invited. Come on down and watch Clay Anderson launch as a launch guest. Cool. Well, my son might have been 10.
Yeah.
At most. He was 9 or 10.
Mm-hmm.
And his mama couldn't get off work. And so I took a week off work, and me and my boy went to Florida. And there we hooked up with all these old guys that Clay and I knew from the Optimist Club and other places over the years. And we're sitting there watching this launch. And you're thinking, man, that's him on top of that rocket. Ain't that something? And it just, it hits you in the head. And your kid at 10, your kid still thinks you're a god. And at 12, the world changes. But at 10, Dad, you really know that guy? Is that really Uncle Clay up there? Yep, they're on top. You met Uncle Clay. You remember? Yeah, Dad. Really? Yep. Up it goes. And man, that little kid's just watching. And
how was Dad feeling?
Dad was cheering, man. Dad and every one of your friends was cheering. Me and Whitley and all them guys. Paul and
yeah,
I think Stan was there.
Yeah.
And I mean, we were all just cheering our heads off. And then I was getting email from you while you were on orbit, which was cool. I still got a bunch of that. And I got a bunch of that. Special pictures that your buddy Clay's up there and he says, this one's important to me. And I wish your dad could have seen that.
Yeah.
I'm going to jump sideways. My very favorite Clay story. Clay was a high school ball player. I'm about as unathletic as a rock, but Clay was a serious athlete. And Clay tells me this story one time about he's running down the field for a touchdown. He's running his tail off. The crowd's going berserk. And somehow he finds out, I don't know if you looked over or somebody told you afterward, while Clay is running down the field, his daddy is running down the sideline right next to it. And so when you were on orbit, I always thought to myself, your daddy's standing right there with you. He can't tell you he's there, but he's right there. And that was in my mind when you were up there.
That's a good story.
I love that story. It's one of my favorite about you.
Yeah, my father passed away in 1984, about a few months after I was hired full time at the Johnson Space Center.
Yeah, you hadn't been here long.
No, I'd been here a short time, and he was having some medical issues. And I think about November, Thanksgiving time frame, he and I talked on the phone in the office, and I planned to go home at Christmas, which I did, but he had a stroke just before that. So, I'm with you, Blair. He was watching, and for those of you listening to the Making of an Ordinary Spaceman podcasts, Susan and I, my wife, do an episode where we talk about a butterfly on the launch pad when we did our spouse pad tour before I launched for the first time, and we're pretty sure that was Dad fluttering around our head on the launch pad. So hopefully folks will continue to listen and catch that podcast episode as well. So do you have any other favorite Clay stories as we went through life, as we went through astronauting, or as we went Christmas tree sales with the Clear Lake Noon Optimist Club over by Highway 3 and NASA Road 1.
Clay was an intern. It was that very first summer. Eric and I were right out of school. Eric was a mechanical engineer.
Right.
And he fancied himself an inventor. He wanted to be an inventor. God bless him. I loved Eric. I miss him terribly. And he would have these ideas and he'd draw them for us on the board. And one day he has an idea that he calls the cat vac.
Oh, God, yes. I forgot about
I told this story at his funeral, so it's okay to tell it on the podcast. Eric's telling me about it. Well, Blair, Clay and I are sitting there. He says, Blair, he says, you know how your cat sheds hair all over the place? I said, yeah, I had cats growing up. I get that. He says, I got a great idea. I call it the cat vac. And he draws it. And what it amounts to is a big box, clamshell kind of box. And the cat's head sticks out of the box, kind of like the old medieval stocks. Cat's head sticking out of the box. And he's got a port to which he can attach a wet dry vac. Now the cat's head sticking out. The cat's body's in the box, and there's a vacuum cleaner running. You ever seen cats around vacuum cleaners? It ain't pretty. And Clay and I are looking at that, and we don't want to, we don't really know each other all that well yet. It ain't been but a couple of months, and we're all competing, and we're young tough bucks. And Clay looks at him. He says, Eric, he says, there's one problem here. Well, what's the problem, Clay? Because Eric spent time thinking this out. Eric, how you gonna get the cat out of the cat vac after you ran that vacuum? What do you think's gonna happen? Eric, I don't think Eric ever solved that part of the technical problem. Yeah, Eric, what do you think's gonna happen?
Oh yeah. I totally forgotten about that story.
Oh, I love that story. It was like, yeah. Oh, other stories. God, there's so many good ones.
Well, what'd you think? What were you thinking when I did my first spacewalk? Did you have any thoughts then? Were you watching it all? I know spacewalks are really, really boring and they're long, and I totally get that most people.
I was thinking, be careful, dummy. Be real careful. Because you guys make it look easy, but I understand how much doggone work goes into learning to do that. And I also understand that, try as hard as we can. Spacewalking's dangerous, and you got to be careful. You got to think. And that's why you train so hard. I was thinking, be careful, dummy. That's all I was thinking.
Well, as I went out the hatch that morning, my first spacewalk, right? And I was going out with a Russian cosmonaut whose English was probably a skosh better than my Russian, right? But between the two of us, we were going to Runglish our way through this spacewalk, right? And I'm the lead, the EV1, they call it. And I go out first and I hook up our safety tethers, right? And the week prior, the month prior, Fyodor had done 2 spacewalks with my crewmate Oleg Kotov, right? 2 Russian spacewalks, and they were rookies. So now he's an expert. And I remember him floating by me in the lab module when I was working. He'd say, "Clay, spacewalk, go slow, be careful." And I'd say, "Good advice, Fyodor, thanks." And then he'd fly off, right? A couple days later, he'd come back and he'd go, "Clay, spacewalk coming. Remember, go slow, be careful," right? Yes, sir. I got it. So I poke out of the hatch. I hook my safety tethers up. Everything's good. Fyodor's head is up in the hatch. He's still in the airlock, and he's handing me stuff out, and I'm clipping it in the places we're supposed to hand it. And he finally comes out. His safety tethers are all hooked, and I'm messing with something, and I look up, and he's gone. He's gone. I don't know where he went. He took off. And, so not sure of what to do. In my best Russian possible, I said, Fyodor, остановиться час, stop now. And then I said, нам нужно делать вместе. We need to do it together. I had no idea if it was going to work, but a few minutes later, here he comes, crawling back down so I could at least see him, right? Because spacewalking is the ultimate team thing, right? It's like scuba diving. You got to have a partner and you got to watch each other and do those things. So, Blair, as we come to the end of this podcast episode, I want to say thank you, first of all, for agreeing to be a guest and fighting through the NASA red tape that allowed us to do this podcast and put it out there for people to listen to. But I also want people to know how grateful I am to guys like Blair. I love this man. Our lives, we were tightly intertwined as young engineers. But then as life goes on, you kind of separate apart, you do your own thing for a while, and hopefully you come back together. And it's kind of an ebb and flow of contact. And since I've retired, Blair and I have had lunch a few times together, which is always great to catch up. He has a wonderful family. And I just want to say thank you to you for being a part of this, because the making of an ordinary spaceman, this ordinary spaceman, would never have been possible without the influences, the friendship, and the activities and things that you and I did together as young engineers. I want everyone out there listening to know that this is a pretty special guy right here.
There's one more thing I want to say for people listening. You hear him use the phrase, the ordinary astronaut. He's more ordinary than you realize. This is a guy who climbed as high as you can climb and never forgot the little people along the way. And I mean, whatever I am to you, Clay, okay, I'm honored. But I remember when my son and I were flying to your first launch, and we're in the airport, and I run into two long retired NASA admin officers. And admin officers were almost always, in those days, they were almost always extremely senior civil service secretaries who they knew everything. They could make anything happen. Anything from the simplest piece of paper to getting you approval for XYZ. They were amazing human beings who never got enough credit. And there's these two individuals who were long retired. And I said, what are you guys doing here? We're flying down for Clay's launch. Now, admin officers never got enough credit for what they were doing. But Clay remembered them. And Clay invited them. Because when you hear the ordinary astronaut thing, he really is an ordinary guy. He's the next door neighbor boy who made good. He's never forgot the guy that lived down the street that used to help him wash his bike. That's important to me. I just wanted to throw that in here.
Thank you, my friend. I appreciate you and love you very much.
Thank you. If you need something, you know to call me.
Absolutely. Keep doing great things for NASA, my friend, and I look forward to your retirement party in about 4 years.
Oh, my God. Yeah, I got to forget to invite you.
I have some stories I can tell.
Yeah, there are stories we can't tell on this podcast. Don't you be telling those on this podcast. I won't have a job. All right, my friend.
My friend. Let's do one soon.
We'll do it. All right, man. You take care.
You too, buddy. Thank you.
Yep.
Please rate, review, follow, and subscribe, as it helps others find my podcast. Thank you for listening. And a special thank you to my dear friend Chip Davis of Mannheim Steamroller fame for the use of his talents and music.
A Hurrdat Media Production.